And then, okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, it's good to be here and see you all in person. Good for a number of reasons. You know, Brian's really done a great job of handling all the IT stuff and the remote connection. The way we did things, though, I was recording from home, and I couldn't tell if anybody was actually watching or not. I was sort of teaching by faith, if you will. Now I can see there are people out there. But anyway, I'm really appreciative of Brian and all the...
Like the pianist last night who was like needing applause.
That's right. People are used to being up front. They like positive feedback, I guess, or something like that, or just to know that it's going out to somebody or somebody. But now I have some proof, visual proof. That helps. I had scheduled today to talk about African American Christianity or black Christianity, and there's so many things I could talk about and a lot of different ways I could go. But in the end, I decided to do something related, but not exactly the same thing as black Christianity, and that was talk about Frederick Douglass. A couple of years ago, I gave an address. Geneva College invited me to come over and speak on the 200-year anniversary of Frederick Douglass's birth. And so I had this presentation, and for various reasons I thought, well, I'll try it out with you folks. There's a little bit of intellectual history and philosophy, but I hope that won't make you nod off and fall asleep too much. But I think Frederick Douglass is an important and very, very fascinating sort of person. So, time travel. As a historian, every now and then I think about going back to the past. Like if I could go back in history, there's so many different times and places where I'd like to just go back and observe and see what is going on. And one event that would be at the top of my list would be to go to Boston in 1842 when Frederick Douglass, who was a little-known 24-year-old black man, got up to speak. Now, most white people in the 1840s, they just weren't used to blacks as public speakers, and they weren't quite sure what to make of it. And then on top of that, consciously or unconsciously, most white Americans, including a lot of abolitionists, saw blacks as ignorant and uncivilized. And some would have been a bit scared of a black man. Everyone at that meeting would have been aware of and remembered Nat Turner, who a decade earlier had led a slave rebellion in Virginia that killed 51 white men, women, and children. So picture this, that meeting in Boston, before Douglass was famous, before he'd written his famous memoir, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Audience members see this rather tall, young, black man get up to the podium, and he says this: "I appear before you, this assembly, as a thief and a robber." See, now that's the moment. That's the moment where I would like to see, how did those people react? Did they show signs of being nervous? Were they fidgeting? Did they get worried? And then Douglass continued on. "I stole this head, these limbs, this body, and ran away from my master with them." And then the audience would get it, right? The absurdity that a person could steal themselves. The absurdity of labeling a person as a piece of property. And at that moment, Douglass was still actually a fugitive. A federal official could arrest him at any moment and transport him back to Maryland and slavery for the crime of stealing himself. At that moment, many people in the audience saw things more clearly than they had seen before. Frederick Douglass was a remarkably gifted man. By all accounts, he was a powerful speaker. He was provocative and creative, mesmerizing, often quite funny. And through the power of words, he could get people to see things more clearly, things that were, in his case, literally right in front of him, in front of them. Yet he never went to college, didn't have a secondary school education, not even a formal primary school education. He was just 27 years old shortly after this when he wrote The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which launched him into a career as an abolitionist and the most famous black man in America, the most prominent spokesperson for blacks arguably in the 19th century. More than 150 years after its publication, in a very different era and culture, a lot of people today still find that book very, very compelling and quite readable. But to fully appreciate Frederick Douglass, there's the book, and his work, we need to do some historical thinking by considering more fully the context in which it happened. It's obvious to us today that slavery is inherently an unjust system. But we are actually in the minority if you compare us to societies throughout the history of the world. Slavery in one form or another had existed in every major region of the world from the beginning of recorded history up through the middle of the 19th century. Now, not every society enslaved people, but many, maybe most did in one form or another. It could be found in Europe, in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas. In 1770, one could find slaves in every colony in the Western Hemisphere, from Canada all the way down through the Caribbean, Central America, all the way through South America. And on July 4th, 1776, every single one of the original 13 slaves for 13 states had slavery. More to the point, before 1700, slavery went unchallenged and unquestioned throughout the world. It was unheard of to think that slavery could or should be eliminated on ethical grounds. Many slaves throughout history, of course, rebelled and tried to escape, and a number of individuals thought slavery was, a terrible system, but there was no organized effort anywhere to try to eliminate the entire system on ethical grounds before 1700. Jump ahead, by 1886, slavery had been legally abolished in every state and colony and nation in the Western Hemisphere. And moreover, the modern conviction that slavery was an unjust system and should not be tolerated had begun to spread to every corner of the globe. And even though illegal forms of slavery still exist in the world today, it's widely accepted as unjust and inhumane. This is a profound and significant shift in human history. The historian Brian Davis says this: the abolition of New World slavery depended in large measure on a major transformation of moral perception. So we Christians in particular should think seriously about a major advance in moral perception in history, how that takes place, because it indicates that the kingdom of God is somehow at work. And it doesn't come quickly or easily. Abolition was a monumental and, quite frankly, a breathtaking project. To think about it, to succeed, abolition had to climb through seemingly insurmountable heights. It had to cross international lines, had to engage dozens of different nations and colonies and social systems. New political movements and policies had to be established. Entire economic systems needed to be reconstructed. Social relations needed to be reconceived. Theological claims needed to be reworked. Media depictions needed to be refashioned. In essence, millions of people had to start seeing the world differently. This is a complicated process. And Frederick Douglass, right in the middle of it all, made major contributions through his tireless work to help people to see more clearly. Now, he helped people by using many different rhetorical devices, many of which can be found in his narrative. Douglass helped his readers see how slavery dehumanized its victims. For instance, in his memoir, he described how, as a 9-year-old, he and 28 others were lined up to be appraised, inspected, and given prices, just like cattle or horses or pigs, and then sold as part of his master's estate. He helped his readers see how slavery corrupted slave owners, describing how Sophia Auld, his master, who had never owned slaves before, slowly transformed from a kindly and caring woman to a master who treated him angrily and harshly. Douglas even explains how he began to see clearly. At the age of 13, he obtained, and he had taught himself to read somehow. That's really pretty amazing. But he obtained and read and reread a school book, The Columbian Orator, which is chock full of concepts about individual liberty and education and religious faith and the rights of man. And he wrote, he had now penetrated the secret of all slavery and oppression and had ascertained their true foundation to be in the pride and the power and the avarice of man. So we might underestimate how difficult Douglas's persuasive task really was. It's not just that many people embraced slavery because their wealth and power were built on the slave system, though this definitely played a very critical part of the problem. It was not just that many people were indifferent to the plight of African Americans, though this certainly functioned as a frustrating role in the whole task. There existed one more particularly thorny problem. Even people of goodwill had a difficult time seeing the injustices of slavery clearly. And this included Christians. And it's here we need to slow down and stop and think about why some Christians saw the slavery issue more clearly than others. Because when it comes to the issues of justice and loving each other more fully, Christians ought to be on the cutting edge, but this, of course, is not always so. So, for many years, Christians turned to the Bible to justify slavery. Now, by 1850, though, after a century of anti-slavery and abolitionist agitation in Europe and the Americas, this biblical pro-slavery argument had begun to weaken everywhere except the United States. And here's an odd and rather troubling truth about American Christianity. In 1850, pro-slavery biblical arguments held stronger sway among Christians in the United States than anywhere else. And why was that? Now, part of the explanation is that the American South had been a slave society rather than a society with slaves. So, in a society with slaves, say Pennsylvania in 1780, slaves played only a minor role in the economy. And the minor role helps explain why northern states responded more positively to anti-slavery and abolitionist movements, the ideals of liberty, especially in the 2 decades after independence, enabling them to eliminate slavery in those states. You see, abolition didn't cost the North as much as it cost the South. But it was not just money. Enslaved societies, like South Carolina, the master-slave relationship not only defined all economic production, but it seeped into every nook and cranny of culture. So, as the historian David Blight describes it, from dawn to dusk, everyone woke, labored, worried about money or hunger, ate, played, competed, loved, hated, married, worshiped God, sang, dreamed, and died in a world shaped at every turn by slavery. Whites and blacks, slave owners and non-slave owners, enslaved people, everyone. The existence of a slave society in the South, however, is only part of the explanation for why the pro-slavery biblical argument was so strong in the United States. We also have to contend with this reality. Many Northerners who had no personal stake in slavery, who did not live and breathe and sleep in a slave society, also believed that the Bible supported slavery. So why is it that many Northern Christians could not reconcile abolition with the Bible? So to help us understand this, let's turn to a debate held in Cincinnati in 1845, the same year that Frederick Douglass published his narrative, and that debate was held between two Presbyterian ministers from the city. Nathaniel Rice, as you see on the right, sorry, your left, Nathaniel's right. Nathaniel Rice, who was pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and Jonathan Blanchard, who later founded Wheaton College and pastored 6th Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati. Now, Rice and Blanchard debated just two questions. Number one, was slaveholding in and of itself sinful? Number two, was the relationship between master and slave a sinful relationship? Two questions. They debated for 8 hours on 4 days. 8 hours each day. And then later, they published their entire debate in a book that ran to 500 pages. You and I, we are attention span weaklings compared to Americans in the 1840s. These two ministers had a lot to say. Rice and Blanchard covered topics ranging from New Testament churches, the ethics of slaveholding laws, Old Testament slavery, Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Aristotle, Constantine, and gophers who evade responsibility. Yes, a rhetorical illustration about gophers made it into the debate. You can find it in the index of the 500-page book. But throughout the debate, however, the most notable arguments centered on interpretations of the Bible. So, for instance, Blanchard, who argued that slavery was a sin, made arguments, and they went something like this. Well, Rice says that God gave slave owners the power to hold slaves as property, but then Rice says that it's wrong for a slave owner to separate a husband from his wife. Therefore, argued Blanchard, Rice was inconsistent by saying that a slave owner could use the power God has given him to hold slaves, but should not use that power to break up a marriage. Rice, on the other hand, made arguments that sounded something like this. Blanchard isn't quoting the Bible. So here's Rice. He says, it is truly singular in a discussion like this that he should give us Bible arguments, yet make not an effort to sustain them with quotations from the Bible. I have but one path, and that is illumined by the Bible. My first position is this. God did recognize the relation of masters and slaves among the patriarchs of the Old Testament. Now, this is a typical example of how antebellum Christians who supported slavery often argued. They turn to a common passage in Genesis, Leviticus, 1 Corinthians, Colossians, or Philemon to show us slavery was acceptable. Look, they said in essence, slavery's in the Bible. The Bible doesn't condemn it. Individual slave owners might be sinful in how they treat slaves, but slavery itself cannot be sinful. Now, these were pretty convincing arguments to many Americans in 1845. But we need to remind ourselves these arguments were not convincing to many non-American Christians. Why were antebellum American Christians so taken with these arguments? It's because they thought in a particular way, in a particular sort of pattern. So, historian Mark Knoll, I think, puts this point very neatly. He said, American Christians were children of the Enlightenment, as well as children of God. What does he mean? Well, the Enlightenment put forth a particular way of thinking about reason, one that put a great deal of trust in human ability to see things clearly without the aid of religion or tradition or faith. Now there are many, many dimensions to the Enlightenment, but the version that proved to be very influential in the United States was shaped by something called common sense philosophy. Now, common sense philosophy promoted the idea that God gave all normal people abilities to see truth clearly, and humans can be certain about these truths. And it tended to regard truths as perspicacious, which means that truths are simple and obvious. So, for instance, all normal people everywhere, even children, can understand that 2 plus 3 equals 5. Doesn't matter what religion you're from, or your political party, what nation you are from. Once one understands that, what numbers are and how addition works, everybody can see 2 plus 3 equals 5. It was thought then, under common sense philosophy, the truth about ethics and government and society can be clearly seen in the same way by anyone. And this mode of thinking was quite popular in the United States. This is a variation of the Enlightenment that really, grabbed hold of Americans because it fits so well with democratic ideals. The famous words from the Declaration of Independence that Americans have loved for 2 centuries kind of embodied this approach. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Self-evident truths. They're obvious. They're common sense. So these Enlightenment ideas seeped into American culture, were embraced by Americans of many stripes, highly educated and minimally educated, Christian, non-Christian, Whig, Democrat, ordinary people. By the time we reached the age of Jackson in the 1830s, most Americans had internalized the idea that the ordinary person could see truths, grasp truth, see it clearly. Now, there are some very beneficial consequences to common sense philosophy. It encouraged common ordinary people to take on new roles in American society. It inspired gifted people who had very little education to make very valuable contributions. Abraham Lincoln, for instance, comes to mind as one of those people. But there are some problems with this particular strand of Enlightenment thinking. For one thing, it's not true. Yes, some things are clear and obvious, but some things are actually quite complicated, and they're not self-evident. Even to highly educated people trained in the life of the mind. This is especially true in issues dealing with human nature, which we often just sort of assume is straightforward. So to illustrate this, let's do a little mind exercise here. You've all heard the phrase, it's not rocket science, right? Implicitly, that means rocket science is the pinnacle of intellectual complexity. All right, so let's say we had 1,000 of the brightest people we could find in the world. And we gave them an just incredible amount of money, I don't know, $100 billion, access to all the knowledge that we have, all sort of texts on everything, and gave them 5 years and then gave them this task. Build a rocket that could take a person to the moon. Could they do it? Oh yeah, we've done that, haven't we? That's right. Sure, they could do that. All right. Second problem. Take the same people, same amount of money, same amount of time, all the resources they have, give them this task. Bring peace to the Middle East. Okay, now maybe I'm not being fair. Maybe bringing peace to the Middle East is kind of like building a rocket to Pluto or something. So let's just narrow our scope down. Same people, all that money. We'll have a smaller task. Eliminate crime in Canton, Ohio. Get any 2 people in Stark County to understand the truth of vaccinations? Look, it's hard. I mean, really, rocket science is complicated, okay? But you want to know something that's really, truly difficult? Try political science. That's hard. Okay, this hints at, I think, a more significant flaw in common sense philosophy. By claiming that reason functions best when it's detached from faith and tradition, the Enlightenment pushed aside a long-standing recognition in the Christian tradition that sin affects our thinking and our perceptions of other humans. In its particular view of reason, the Enlightenment promoted an overly optimistic view of the human ability to see things clearly, and I'd say Exhibit A would be Thomas Jefferson himself, who passionately embraced the Enlightenment idea that equality was a self-evident truth, but he could not get himself to apply this to his 140 enslaved people that he had. Because of sin, we don't see clearly. And I think this is still a critically important point today. For centuries, Christian theology held that sin, particularly the sin of pride, which underlies all the classic vices, distorts our thinking. It's not, I think, mere coincidence that in the modern world we've ignored this point, and as we've ignored this point, the word pride has begun to take on very positive connotations as something to be encouraged and celebrated, when historically Christians held that pride distorts our ability to see ourselves and others clearly. But as children of the Enlightenment, as well as children of God, most of us probably think that, well, we see politics and economics and society and human interactions and motivations of others pretty clearly. Now, 19th century American Christianity helps us gain some perspective on the human condition. Steeped in common sense philosophy, Christian leaders argued over and over again that the Bible was simple to understand and that its truths could clearly be seen by anyone. And as a result, many American Christians displayed a strong tendency to view the Bible as a collection of facts, sort of like a textbook that you just open up. Actually, I've heard Christians talk about the Bible that way. It's just full of these facts that you open up and you see. And so the person reading the Bible was to just open up, look at the facts, gather the evidence, organize it. Once you've done that, it was thought the truth would be clearly seen. You do this just like a scientist studying nature. In fact, we have that very argument. To take one example, a professor at Princeton, James W. Alexander, said this: the theologian should proceed precisely as the chemist or the botanist proceeds. That's how you read the Bible. Now, this helps us understand a little bit better what was going on in the debate between Nathaniel Rice and Jonathan Blanchard. Rice kept hammering away at specific texts and Bible verses. He kept asking Blanchard, in essence, to examine the Bible like he was a botanist. Where's the Bible verse? Find that. Bring it out. Blanchard, meanwhile, he was in a situation where he had to turn to general principles of the Bible. Now, he was also shaped by common sense philosophy, and so he said abolition was based on the broad principle of common equity and, here it is, common sense. But his biblical argument in that time and place was a hard sell. To Rice, Blanchard didn't seem to have any facts to support his point. So, during antebellum America, Christians used this pattern of thinking when debating slavery. Christians who supported slavery argued and ordered biblical texts as if they were simple and plain and obvious facts. And meanwhile, those who opposed slavery were compelled to lay out nuanced and sophisticated and complicated interpretations of the Bible. Interpretations that drew upon the insights of scholars and experts. But most Americans, maybe this is true today, were suspicious of nuanced and sophisticated and complicated interpretations of the Bible. And many Americans then and now were suspicious of experts. If experts needed to interpret the Bible, it was thought then ordinary Christians couldn't understand everything in the Bible for themselves. Now, common sense philosophy also missed the reality that our perceptions of the world are shaped and distorted and clarified by the culture we live in. Historians sometimes say the past is a foreign country. They do things differently over there. And from our vantage point in the early 21st century, it's possible to see how historical context, the culture of a slave society, shaped the thinking of those who enslaved black Americans. So, as another exercise, a rather unsettling one, imagine that you were born into a white slave-owning family in Georgia in 1810. So you would have grown up We're hearing that, the Bible justified slavery, most likely. The world around you was built on slavery. Your family that you loved held slaves. You would have heard sermons telling slaves to obey their masters. Your teachers would have taught you that slavery itself was not sinful, but you do have some individual slave owners who treat their slaves badly. And abolitionists would have been depicted as distant, wild-eyed radicals who wanted to come down and tear apart the world you knew and loved. If you grew up in that world, if I grew up in that world, we probably would have thought that slavery was fine. Slavery would appear to us as an obviously justifiable system. And common sense philosophy would not have helped. It really wouldn't have done anything to help us to see that we are shaped by our culture, and our culture had put us into a groove that was unjust. And this produced another problem. For those who grew up thinking that truths were obvious and simple, particular kinds of conflicts arose among deep and knotty problems and debates. So if all truths are self-evident, why doesn't my opponent see them clearly? Right? Somebody must be either stupid or calculating incorrectly, and if I know I'm a person of goodwill, and if I'm looking at my logic and it all fits together, then the problem's not with me. Right? Another Presbyterian minister, Henry Van Dyke, Presbyterian minister in Brooklyn in the north, shows us how this happened. The northerner, who said this: When the abolitionist tells me that slaveholding is a sin, in the simplicity of my faith — notice that term, simplicity, right? The Bible, my faith in the Holy Scriptures. The Bible is full of these simple, obvious facts. I point to the sacred record. I tell him in all candor, as my text does, that his teachings blaspheme the name of God and his doctrine. This is a serious charge. It's not just that the abolitionists have calculated incorrectly. They are sinning. And this is not just any sin, it's blasphemy, which often carried the connotation that one is willfully, consciously misusing God's name. Apparently, Van Dyke believed that abolitionists were not acting out of a sincere conviction, but were knowingly disobeying God because they ignored simple and obvious biblical truths. Now, I don't know anything else about this Henry Van Dyke fellow. I do actually know a couple of things about Presbyterianism, even though I've only been attending this church for 4 months. And I know this: the Westminster Confession, key creed of Presbyterianism, says this: all things in Scriptures are not alike plain in themselves, nor alike clear unto all. Yet those things which are necessary to be known, believed, and observed for salvation are clear. Some things are not clear, other things are clear. The things for salvation are so clearly propounded and opened in some place of Scripture or other that not only the learned, but the unlearned, in a due use of the ordinary means, may attain unto them a sufficient understanding of them. So, not everything is clear, but some things are clear in the Bible. Westminster Confession was written 1646. Before the Enlightenment shoved aside the historical recognition that sin affects our thinking. Before common sense philosophy declared that all truths were simple and evident. Before the democratized impulses in American culture convinced Americans that they don't need experts or scholars to help them work through the Bible or theology or difficult and knotty issues. So in other words, back to our original point, Frederick Douglass and his fellow abolitionists were battling very powerful cultural forces. They were not only struggling against those whose greed led them to hold on to slavery and those who cared very little for fellow human beings. They were battling a culture that convinced people of goodwill, including millions of sincere Christians, that they saw everything clearly. Now, Douglass knew the Bible very well. He had a conversion experience when he was a young teenager as a Methodist at a Methodist revival near his plantation. And this first year, when he was free, he was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and before he wrote his narrative, he launched out he was a preacher. He preached in the local African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Throughout his life, he quoted the Bible regularly, drew upon biblical themes from his rhetoric. But Frederick Douglass did not find common sense ways of thinking compelling. Douglass, like most black Americans, saw that the sin of slavery was simply not obvious to an awful lot of people. Douglass did not view the Bible as simply a storehouse of facts to be analyzed like a scientist. He understood that the Bible contains metaphor, prophecy, irony, paradox, poetry, and that properly understood, these were just as true as any simple fact that existed in Scripture. Douglass also saw something that many white Christians, it was very hard for them to see: how race distorted the thinking of many Christians. In 1861, he wrote this: "Nobody in the North, we think, would defend slavery even from the Bible if it weren't for the color distinction." Now, we want to notice this point about the color distinction that he says here. In other words, Douglass says that race leads many white Northerners to accept the idea of slavery. He went on to say, "The same book which is full of gospel liberty to one race is crowded with arguments in justification of slavery of another. Those who shout and rejoice at the progress of liberty would mob down and pray and preach down liberty at home as an unholy and unjust, hateful thing." Okay, the color distinction. So, just what does the what does the Bible say about race and racism? Nothing. Not directly, that is. Now, it is true that in the Bible, people still categorized other people, put them in the categories for good and for ill. And so we find all kinds of different ethnicities and nations in the Bible: Edomites and Hittites and Babylonians, and Jews, Greeks, Romans. We find examples of people with dark skin, like the Ethiopian eunuch. But the Bible does not really discuss race, at least in the way we think about it. And the reason for this is because race is a modern way of categorizing people groups. The 16th and 17th century transatlantic slave trade developed the idea that, of course, there are categories of people. Everybody categorized people all through history, all down every road. But their idea was there are categories of people labeled black and white, and that the differences among them can be explained by their physical characteristics. And that is a legacy that is still with us today. Race is a very tricky thing. It's deeply embedded in our culture, for good and for ill. It has power. It shapes our perceptions of the world. And oddly, despite its pervasiveness, we are unconscious of all the ways it shapes our perceptions. We too are drawn to think that race is a simple and obvious thing. So let's return to that debate in Cincinnati. Take a closer look at Jonathan Blanchard and Nathaniel Wright. No, let's look at Jonathan Blanchard here for a moment, just by himself, the abolitionist. I think it is fair to say that Blanchard was colorblind, or he argued from a colorblind position. In the 4-day debate, Blanchard tried his best to show why American slavery was unjust by arguing about everything from New Testament churches, the Old Testament laws, Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Aristotle, Constantine, and yes, gophers. But oddly and tellingly, Blanchard did not bring up race. Surely that qualifies as a colorblind approach to the question of slavery. And in his colorblind approach to the Bible, Blanchard missed something big and important. He could have raised an interesting argument. Blanchard could have challenged Rice to show him where the Bible says that one particular race could be enslaved while another race was absolved from being enslaved. In response, Rice would have been hard-pressed to find biblical facts to support that blacks could be enslaved and whites could not, other than the shaky curse of Ham argument, which actually was not used very much in the antebellum debates, and it didn't even come up in this debate, for instance. The omission of race in this debate speaks volumes, if we can see it, once we recognize that it wasn't there. Antebellum Americans certainly talked about race, but when they tried to understand the Bible and what the Bible said about slavery, neither Blanchard nor Rice, nor just about any other white Christian abolitionist brought up race because race was not an obvious topic in the Bible. As a result, it slipped by, unseen and unnoticed in Christian thinking about the Bible. Now, Jonathan Blanchard was a serious Christian leader who cared deeply about the issue of slavery. He saw the injustices of the system. He earnestly searched the Scriptures to try to determine what Christians were to do about this system, and I give him a lot of credit for these things. But in terms of seeing clearly, it was not enough. Like many other white Christians, he failed to see that race made a huge difference between slave systems in the Bible and the slave system in the United States. It was one of many differences between those forms of slavery, by the way. On issues of race, the Bible was not simple and self-evident and obvious to everyone, not even to an abolitionist like Jonathan Blanchard. The flaws of culture, as well as individual pride, distort the human ability to see things clearly. Jonathan Blanchard needed Frederick Douglass. White abolitionists, anti-slavery folk, and white Christians everywhere in America needed Douglass and black abolitionists like him. And historians are finding today that the influence of black abolitionists on white abolitionists is even greater than what we used to think it was, as we're looking at this more closely. Because black abolitionists saw clearly that racism was a deeply anti-Christian force. White Christians also needed Douglass because he showed America what slavery looked like to the slave. They needed Douglass because black Americans saw more clearly than white Americans how deeply slavery contradicted and undermined American ideals of freedom and equality and justice for all. And we also need Frederick Douglass today for a number of reasons. Number one, we need Frederick Douglass because his persuasive efforts among fellow Americans reminds us that none of us see everything clearly. Even if we are thoughtful, sincere, and logical, we still have blind spots. In fact, the Bible speaks of blind spots. In Leviticus 5, the children of Israel are commanded to offer sacrifices for sins they unintentionally commit or are unaware of. Jesus, in John 9, when he heals the blind man, speaks about the blindness of the Pharisees. Should compel us to sort of humbly consider moments when we have pharisaical impulses. Psalm 19, the psalmist praises God for the laws, the ordinances, the commandments of the Lord, the foundations of justice. He says there's great reward in following them, and then he takes a sudden turn and asks, but who can detect their errors? Clear me from hidden faults. And I take that to mean the faults that are hidden from me, even. Sins we do not see. So I think we need to bring back the pre-Enlightenment Christian insight, the Westminster Confession. Sin distorts our thinking in a wide range of ways. We need to pray that God will show us our blind spots. It's a dangerous prayer because God answers prayers, and we probably won't like what we see, but it's a good prayer for that very reason. Second reason why we need Frederick Douglass, because we live with the legacies of history for good and for ill. We need to see these legacies more clearly. Slavery has been long abolished, and that's a great legacy, but racism lives on. In fact, our social conflicts, our debates, our overconfident claims that we see racial matters clearly indicate we may actually have more in common with antebellum America than what we would wish. We also need to recognize how the legacy of common sense philosophy keeps us from seeing clearly. Without a recognition that sin distorts our thinking, we believe too readily and too often that we all see complicated, multidimensional issues of race very clearly. Too often we assume that those who disagree with us are consciously motivated by wicked desires. Too often we self-righteously convince ourselves of our own clear-thinking innocence. Seems to me, in the past few years, those of us who are Christians have not comported ourselves very well on these sort of points. Third reason we need Frederick Douglass. It's because the slavery debate of antebellum America gives us insight into a major worldwide historical development in moral transformation. Despite the injustices of slavery, despite the cultural sins of racism, the world came to see that slavery was wrong. And this is a historical legacy we live with. A great one. Today, just everybody knows, understands. We feel it deeply down inside of us, almost like it's an instinct, or as some people in the past would say, like common sense, that slavery is wrong. Fourth graders know that slavery is wrong. This transformation in moral perceptions ought to instill in us humility and gratitude. Because, see, none of us came to that conclusion on our own. None of us risked our lives to escape slavery. We didn't reach our convictions about slavery by wrestling with complicated ethical and economic and political theological issues in a debate in a cultural context that was hard to understand. None of us have been confronted with the reality that we would lose a large proportion of our wealth should our society decide that slavery was wrong. We didn't face ridicule or violence by campaigning tirelessly against a culture that would not see things clearly. Frankly, you and I have contributed nothing to the principle that slavery is wrong. Yet we might still cast a smug eye on earlier generations. We may consider ourselves morally superior to those from centuries ago that held slaves. We might be troubled to discover that very good Christians from earlier centuries held slaves, people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. What was wrong with these people, we might ask? We assume we would have understood that slavery was an evil and unjust system, and we would be wrong about ourselves. The conviction that slavery is wrong is a gift to us. We did not pay for it, we didn't work for it, we didn't achieve it through intellectual effort, we didn't earn it through our own righteousness. It was handed to us by the toil and agony and struggles of countless people who went before us, people like Frederick Douglass. And we should be grateful for this. We should be grateful that through the grace of God, they handed us a culture where slavery is almost universally understood to be unjust. And finally, Frederick Douglass, his engagement with abolitionists and slave owners, Christians, non-Christians, black Americans, white Americans, northerners, southerners, shows us that we actually don't think for ourselves. As Alan Jacobs, a Christian scholar, points out, everything we think is in response to what somebody else has thought. In other words, the development of clear thinking is a group project. We need respectful public conversations about a diverse range of people because we are all limited in what we individually can know. We need others to help us see our own blind spots. Those of us who are white Christians particularly need to be intentional about listening carefully to black Christians and others who are in the minority, because history shows it's far easier for those in the majority to simply overlook or ignore or quickly dismiss those who are not in their close circle of acquaintances. Frederick Douglass saw the racial sins of slavery more clearly than almost all white Americans. But he did not see everything clearly. He often stereotyped and caricatured Irish immigrants. He argued that Native Americans did not face discrimination. We could go on with conflicts and problems he had in his personal life. But that rather demonstrates the point, doesn't it? We have work to do. We're called, among other things, to work for a just society, to hold each other accountable, to love one another as God loves us. So may we all be open to the grace of God to help us to rise to the challenge of seeing things more clearly. We have a few minutes. If you have questions or comments. Yes. Yes. Yeah, which one? There are a lot of good comments. Yes. Right, right. And so again, important to listen to, listen to a lot of other people and people around today and people who have gone before us, certainly. Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't care, whoever.
I was wondering about Frederick Douglass as far as his education went. Was he a house slave or a farm slave?
He was actually at different times a little bit of both. At one point he was a farm slave, one time he was a house slave, but there was a time in life when he, as a boy, he had the freedom to go into town and run errands, and he had a certain amount of free time, and it was then that he'd meet other white boys, and he'd pick up scraps of things, and he'd actually play games with them to kind of trick them into teaching him how to read. I mean, he was really very, very clever. Once he got to learn how to read, he just started reading all kinds of things he could get his hands on. Yes?
So my understanding is that the Quakers had come to abolitionism quite early.
Yeah.
And even paid their slaves when they freed them.
Right.
As a faith community.
Yeah.
So where did they fit in this conversation, since they came to it almost 100 years before
Right.
The Civil War?
Whew, yes, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. The Quakers don't get enough credit for this because they really were the first group to start a movement to try to eliminate slavery. And 1730s and 40s, it was American Quakers and English Quakers together. And they started first in their churches. And important Quaker, John Woolman, we have a building at Malone named after Woolman. I'm so happy we do. It's interesting to see how he would go and meet with other Quakers in a meeting house and how he would reason with them, because he would not just argue as if to try to prove a point. He would go in and he'd try to gauge the spirit of the meeting and the spirit of himself, to know what kind of attitude. And sometimes he felt like if things were he'd gauge how people were talking. He said, this is not the time to bring it up. Sometimes he'd look at himself and he'd say, I think it would be like, I'm feeling too arrogant and angry. It would not be helpful for me to bring this up right now. And then when he did engage them, he talked about what they had in common. He says, we as Quakers believe this in the Bible. We believe this truth. We believe that everybody has the inner light. So he was finding a lot of common ground. It was really different from the debate that Blanchard and Rice got into, which is also kind of an Enlightenment thing. You prove your point, I prove my point, and then we add up the points at the end. But it was a persuasion that was actually grounded in Quaker tradition and in biblical insight, and also, I think, just sort of a sense that the Holy Spirit is at work. So, but they're another, they'll do a whole section on Friends and a whole host of things too, yeah.
Well, having said that, I wonder if that can be more of a model or a hope for us as a Christian community, as far as the impact that we potentially can have in being countercultural and being God's light in the community.
I think that's a great point. And it occurs to me as I'm answering your question that one thing they did is they started with themselves. I mean, they went around just to Quaker meetings. They didn't go out and then to other people and say, you people. It's like, no, we have to take care of our own business first. before they, you know, tried to take that to somebody else. But there's all kinds of other things, you're right, in there that would be great to look at. Yeah, that's a wonderful point.
I think I heard today that a concept that I wasn't familiar with, so my heart's a little bit on fire. But racism wasn't in the Bible, but we created it for a purpose, to study and to understand our culture. And I'm such a cornball, but Sylvester Stallone in Rocky, remember at the end of one of the Rocky movies, he says, I came to this place tonight and you hated me, but I changed, you changed, and if we can change, we all can change. I guess that would be my prayer on parting today, that I pray that we all can change the concepts that we've grown up and grown into. If we did grow into them, can't we grow away from them? And can't we do this with our culture? And that would be my prayer for all of us as we live today. And thank you so much for your words.
Thank you for that comment, yes. Thank you.
Did look it up. When Grandpa decided he had to leave Sweden at 19, he immediately changed his name because after all, Sven Orchestra makes a little Swedish.
Yeah, very Swedish.
So he changed his name to something a little more Germanish.
I mean, 2 times a week for an hour each or
So
something.
he decided to get married.